Welcome, everybody. I know that if you work in documentary films, you probably, like me, already watch a lot of docs, get a lot of inspiration and ideas from documentaries. But I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective today, and that's from a cinematic perspective, from fiction film. And this is not about fancy equipment, jibs, and stuff that's going to make your add more cost to your budget, but it's about the fundamentals of story, which in my opinion is a bit lacking. It's getting a bit stronger, but I'm always eager and enthusiastic to help sort of spread the word when it comes to storytelling. So my background really comes from I come originally from a news background, so it was like having, as probably many of you do as independent filmmakers, having a $5 budget, and it's like, how do I make it look like $1 million? So I focus more about story than about the technology, which I really think takes a back seat to good storytelling. So what I've done is taken my 2-day course and I've distilled it down to an hour. So this is really not about formula, it's about process. And in doing so, at the end of this, what I'm going to give you is a really powerful process which is going to provide you some creative freedom. And that's what I think everybody wants, is like, how do I, once I start shooting, how do I make it as creative as possible? And it's really by having a solid process up front. So I'm going to help you sort of connect the dots when it comes to storytelling today. And really, you may have not ever even considered this about the steps of the creative process. But I think one of the first things to recognize is that you're an artist, and you're in filmmaking for primarily because you love it. So these are the steps of really the creative process, and I'll leave you to explore those on your own a little bit more, but I think it's just really important to sort of recognize the creative process. The execution part, number 5, which you could consider production and post-production, in my mind is really secondary to all the stuff that happens before. One of the, you're going to have one of the things I want to make sure by the end of this webinar is that you understand about, I have an idea for a story, and how do I execute it? And, and a good example of this is a story that I did a couple years ago for the Discovery Channel, and it was really based on an idea from another show that they did, and I was just fascinated by the story, and it was about one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, Gus Grissom, who came back and splashed down in the Atlantic and his capsule sank, and they went and they recovered his capsule from, I think it was like 15,000 feet of water. And I thought, that's just really cool. What could be the coolest thing that I could go uncover and find? And I thought, well, a nuclear weapon would be kind of cool. So that was the inspiration and the idea for going and exploring the idea of, is there a nuclear weapon out there to be found, and who are the characters who are out there trying to find it? So your inspiration can come from a lot of places, but I'm going to give you a process today that's going to help you get there fast and efficiently. So this is just a good thing to recognize, that you're an artist, and you're not building bumpers at the Chrysler factory. So the story process, this is really about the process that you're going to go through identifying your story. And what I'm going to try to introduce here is a bit of a paradigm shift. I think in documentary filmmaking, there's this myth maybe that, if you're not making it up on the fly and exploring and shooting everything, that's really not documentary storytelling. And I want to give you a process that's kind of opposite of that, where you're going to do a lot of the work up front to identify the story, so that when you get out in the field, it's all going to be about, how do I tell this very creatively. So, and again, as you see, production is one of the smallest, production and post-production is one of the smallest parts of this entire process. So I want to introduce you to this idea of something that I call front-end loading. And it's doing the heavy lifting up front takes a lot of brain power and hard work, but it's the insurance policy against finding yourself with a dysfunctional and inoperative story. Now, you can polish and refine a story in post, but you can't fix it. Being a filmmaker that I produce and direct and I shoot all of my own stuff, that editor, I can't tell you, is the editors among all of the job functions of the people that I consult with and work with, they're the ones who I think understand story probably better than anybody, including, you know, most producers. So what is cinema? What does it mean to be cinematic? Well, this is a term most often used to describe the principles and techniques employed in feature film production, which has been around a long time and arguably is one of the most powerful forces in every culture on the planet. Movies are able to move people in ways that really no other creative process can. Arguably, documentaries can move people to action a lot more than feature films, but I'm going to focus today a little bit more on the feature film component of cinema and how that can elevate and improve your documentary storytelling. Now, you know, if we look at the definition, the traditional definition of documentary, it's the use of moving images to document some aspect of reality for instruction or historical record. Well, that sounds pretty boring. So I'm going to, in this webinar, I'm going to give you a process where you're going to be able to elevate and make your stories a lot more powerful and a lot more creative. Now, one of the people that really inspired me when I was, I started off in this very small market television, was a guy named Charles Kuralt, who did this great piece where he would, called On the Road, where he would travel around America and he would do these small pieces on characters that were only a couple of minutes long. But what he was really able to do was capture the humanity of people. And really, that's what good storytelling is about. It's about people, and it's about capturing their humanity, because that's what's going to be sticky for your audience. So storytelling, when it comes to what we do in documentary filmmaking, is really about the conveying of events using moving images and sound. Now, there's a pretty finite list. I mean, it's about a half a dozen points long about the kind of images that you're going to use in your telling your documentary. And obviously, the number one is live action. You're going to go out and you're going to film a character, and that's really is going to be what's going to carry your story. And then you're going to have archival photos and maybe some footage. If you're doing a historical documentary, and there could be some reenactments, whether they're historical or iconoclastic reenactments. Historical reenactments, I kind of I separate them into two groups. Historical reenactments being that you're going to use actors to retell a part of your story, or iconoclastic reenactments where maybe you're just using time and location. Now, I'll give you a good example of this is the documentaries that are done by Ken Burns. I mean, Ken Burns, very seldom will he have an actor in a shot. One of my favorite Ken Burns' documentaries, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out, is his documentary on Thomas Jefferson. And we see there is an actor in some of these scenes, but you ever only see them in silhouette. But mostly it's about time and location, and Ken Burns is an incredibly good storyteller. He's really brilliant at using tone to impart a mood in his stories. So, and again, when it comes to doing any kind of reenactments, any kind of choice that you're going to make, whether it's the choice of a camera or the editing equipment that you're going to use, we're going to let the story decide. I think that's one of the really important things. We're not going to impose any kind of style on a story. We're going to let the story decide, and that will become very evident as we go through this process. One of the other things that you're going to use is, graphics, maybe maps, blueprints, or animation, and CGI, which is, a great new tool to be able to tell and illustrate scenes that we just couldn't do before. So another thing about the image part of what we do is, and I want you to think, is about, and whether you're a writer or not, and I started out as a cinematographer. I write my own documentaries, but I think the most important part of the writing process is the use of the camera. That's really the first part of in the production process of editing and composition is a process of including or eliminating information. So as we get further down into the webinar and into the process, you're going to see a little bit more about how editing, that this is all a process of editing. From the moment that you have the idea to the time that you deliver your final product, it's really all about editing at the end. So there's really two kinds of visual narratives when we talk about documentaries. Illustrative is probably the oldest tradition of documentary filmmaking, and that's, say dog, see dog, and it's really taking a radio script or a piece of narration and illustrating it with pictures. And it's not very powerful. It's the kind of thing most commonly used in news reporting, where it's filled with facts and figures. But the second one, and the most powerful, is sequential, where you use images grouped together that tell a story without even any audio. If you watch a documentary, any really good documentary, you watch it without the sound, and the pictures tell the story. Really, the narration and the writing is to get you from scene to scene and fill in the holes. But it's really all about writing with the camera. And secondly, sound. There's really two ways that you're going to convey your character, and it's through sound and it's through action. And in character actuality, captured during the action of a scene, is going to be far more powerful than any piece of written narration. You're also going to get interviews from characters, observers, or experts who provide critical analysis. You may have interviews in your documentary. They could be, the classic sit down or walk and talk. Music, and that really plays a lot to tone, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And sound effects, and lastly, narration. So when I talk about, cinematic documentary storytelling, really what I'm talking about is employing the principles of feature film production and narrative structure to tell a nonfiction story. So, and really the focus here is more on feature film narrative than it is about the production value. There's been some amazing documentaries that that have had very low production value. You know, that the image is not that good, the sound might be questionable, but at the end of the day, it's all going to ride on the story, and that's where I'm going to focus on today and help you get to, is the story, which is really the heart and soul of documentary. So this is a term that I like to use more than documentary, because classical documentary, I really don't think, you know, anybody had this kind of model and this kind of paradigm in mind when documentaries were first made. So I want you to start thinking about documentaries as more as non-fiction drama. That's really what you're creating, is you're creating stories about real people and real events, and using those great narrative tools laid down in feature filmmaking to tell those stories. So types of documentaries. Well, there's lots of genres, but I really break them down into two types. And number one is a report. Reports are often, you know, very illustrative visually. They're not that memorable for the most part. Now, I have seen really good reports. I mean, if you watch any shows like Frontline or 60 Minutes is very report-driven, still very interesting. But to me, the most powerful and the most sticky one is story. And it has a lot of different ingredients. It's interesting when I ask people about, you know, what are the most important ingredients of a good documentary, and they list all kinds of things. And depending on what your role is in the filmmaking process, you probably have your own bias. But you know, a lot of people get hung up on technology and the aesthetics of documentary filmmaking. You know, it's about the visuals or the cinema, you know, and the cinematography. But it's kind of like, you know, the best example or metaphor that I can use is kind of like in real estate. And it all comes down to this: story, story, story. And we in the business, I think we get a little bit caught up on the technology. It's like, you know, is this like, did I shoot this in, is it in high def? Is it on red? Is it in 35 millimeter? And at the end of the day, you know, I would suggest that the audience really doesn't care too much about that. And when people ask me about what's the best camera to use, well, I said, well, why don't you ask the story? And they look at me with this kind of very puzzled look, and it's like, well, you could use a Canon SLR or you could shoot it in 3D, but you know, I think you need to ask the story, what's going to best serve the story? So there's really two definitions of story here. One is a story is a sequence of events. It's a retelling of an event that happened. There's going to be some characters involved, plot, some drama. But the one that I want to focus today is on the classic definition of story, which is a narrative featuring a main character. And that's where, for me, where the cinematic part of my job comes in, is in the featuring of a main character. Now, you may ask yourself, like, well, why a main character? Well, this is a guy that really laid down the first principles of drama, and it was Aristotle, who lived during about 335 BC. This is a guy who was a big fan of Greek theater, and I think if he was alive today, he would be even a bigger fan of documentary filmmaking, and he was really the great-grandfather of narrative. But he started to think to himself, like, what are the essential ingredients of a good story? And he obviously based all of his insights on Greek theater, but Aristotle broke it down to 7 essential story elements. Number 1 was the plot. Character was number 2, and he goes through, and you know, if you look at this list, you know, this could be a list for documentary. It could certainly be a list for feature film. You know, decor would be like today in film, like production design. But you know, he had thought a lot of very long and hard about this. And if you ever get a chance, there are some good books out there about Aristotle's Poetics, some really good basics that I think are really essential to kind of even what we do. And it plays, again, to this big question of why story. Well, here are the reasons, and I think they're pretty hard to argue with, of why story. This is the oldest means we have of passing on information. So if you think about the most memorable, making not only your documentary, but making information sticky, when you make it about a person, it's far more memorable than giving people facts and figures and statistics. And I would argue that this is built into your customer's DNA. This is something that we all grow up with, and I, you know, one of the oldest photos that my family, you know, my mom parades around of me is like I'm like, you know, 2 years old holding a book. It's like, you know, tell me a story. And story is not dependent on technology. I mean, story hasn't changed from the early film days to, you know, the high def and 3D kind of era that we're in now, is that story still has the same power and quality that it did 150 years ago. And if you think about it, story is the most influential force on our planet. Everything that you do, every decision that you make is based on story. And Aristotle's, you know, principles about story still hold, you know, 2,300 years later. So it's the thing that is, for us as human beings, when it comes to information, is incredibly sticky. Whether it's in a children's book or a Hollywood blockbuster, story, a well-told story, is incredibly sticky. Now, this is a very interesting picture, and it, you know, I can't help but think about that you've all been kind of in this place before. Here's Albert Einstein looking down at I can imagine him looking down through all of his research, wondering, you know, I know the theory of relativity is in there somewhere, and if I could only find it, I know that it's simple. And he really created the best known equation in history. E equals mc squared, his theory of relativity. And you know, I can't help but think of this is like me every time a producer comes to me and says, hey, I have this really good idea, and I have all of this written material, and I have like 50 DVDs of archive material, but I gotta find a story. So I started to thinking to myself some years ago, well, you know, the theory of relativity is a pretty complex idea that Einstein was able to distill down into a very simple equation. And so I thought, well, can there be an equation for story? And you know, if you've watched anything or read anything about quantum mechanics, you know, quantum mechanics is really about very small things. And Einstein said this really interesting thing about, you know, it should be as simple as possible, but not any simpler. So I started thinking to myself, well, there's got to be a way that I needed to use this in my own work. You know, working in news, starting out in news as a one-man band, when you have a lot of things to manage, it's how can I get to the story quickly and efficiently while I'm, you know, physically driving to the location. I may not know the story until I get there, but I kind of have an idea of what to look for. So this is really where I came up with what I call sort of my quantum theory of story. And it really comes down to this very, very simple equation. And it's so simple, in fact, and I think it's probably many of you are doing this without even knowing it, but I'm going to distill it down to some very simple principles. So by the time that we're all done this, by the time you're done watching this webinar, if you're working on a project, whether you're just starting to research it, or you're about to shoot it, or you're in the editing process, this is going to be a very new, powerful tool that you can employ in all your projects to get to the story very fast and very efficiently. So it really comes down to this. The very first thing to see in the equation is character. Stories are about people, and they're usually about one main character. And character is what gives your story the sticky factor. Because when we watch, whether it's feature films or documentaries or even read a story, we superimpose our own narrative on that of the character, good or bad, that we can identify or see ourselves in that main character. And you know, if you've ever been in any kind of relationship, which you'd have to be living under a rock not to be as a human being, but, you know, we're pretty complex characters with a lot of contradiction. And, you know, I spoke a little bit before about Ken Burns' Thomas Jefferson. I mean, that's a really great example of a character who is replete with contradiction. He is a man who said that all men are created equal but own 300 slaves. So people are not really black and white. We're pretty complex, and we're not usually good guys or bad guys. We're somewhat in the middle, and everybody's got a little bit of that. And it's the character that it's going to be the vehicle, very powerful vehicle, to carry the narrative of your story. So when you're making a film, for the most part, you're not going to be the main character, although in some point of view films, which I'll talk about later, you as a storyteller can be the character, but it's going to be somebody else. And you're going to develop that character through one of two ways: by what they do, by filming what they do, their action, and by what they say, their actuality. Those are, when we talk about character development, those are the two primary ways that you're going to reveal your character to the audience. So the second part of the equation is AQ, and that stands for active quest. Now, this is most likely is going to be a physical journey. If you think about a good example of this would be an expedition film. If you look at The Cove, that's a physical journey. But what's really great about The Cove and what adds emotional depth to any documentary is something that I think that can be often overlooked, is this emotional journey. And if you give this some thought in your own life, everybody, including you, are on a quest. You might not have ever thought about this subconsciously, but you have a primary thing in your life that you are trying to accomplish. I saw a really interesting interview recently with Ali Soufan, one of the interrogators of some of the 9/11 terrorists, and he made a thing that made me think about how powerful having an active quest in a person's life is. That, you know, human beings, we need hope, and people without hope, if you convince them that they can have everlasting life by creating unimaginable acts of terror and giving them a quest, is a very powerful tool. So this is something that even when you're researching a documentary and you've identified some main characters, they might not even know what it is consciously, but it's your job to get to find out what that active quest is, because they all have one. And I'll give you a good example of an active quest is I did a documentary a few years ago for the Discovery Channel about a paleontologist who had found this body, mummified and fossilized body of a dinosaur. And his quest, his physical quest, was to find out if there were internal organs inside this dinosaur. But really, something that was even more interesting to me was his emotional quest, that he was an amateur paleontologist, and really what his physical quest was about was to get validation and acceptance from the mainline science community. So that's something that's often overlooked. So and I'll talk a little bit more about emotional quest, but this speaks a little bit about the stakes. You know, that's the S squared, and it's like, well, Y squared. Well, and I'll talk a little bit when I get down to the casting part of this, but you want to find a character who's got a lot to lose, something worth losing, and is in some kind of physical danger. In the case of my dinosaur documentary, this gentleman was not in physical danger, but he certainly had some emotional jeopardy. His reputation was on the line, and he wanted to prove to everybody that he was just as good as any paleontologist who had a PhD hanging on his wall. So stakes is incredibly important. So this is really the storytelling equation. Is a character plus an active quest over huge stakes is a story. There are a lot of reports done in documentaries. They might kind of come in and out of a story, but for the most part, I think the essence, the core of a story is often missed. And I get asked all the time, well, you know, what's the criteria for a good story? And it's like, number one, having a great character. You know, your characters are going to carry your film, and if you cast it incorrectly or pick the wrong characters, it could really derail you and set you on a course that you can't come back from. You know, and some of this is a little bit subjective based on the storyteller. I mean, is it meaningful? Is it enlightening? Is it original? Those are all metrics that you are going to decide for yourself. Maybe you're going to bounce this idea off a couple of your friends. Is it entertaining? I think entertaining is one of the things that, you know, we look in you may think of a docufilms as, well, you know, entertaining, is that kind of am I selling myself up by being entertaining? And I would say no. It's you know, it's your responsibility. You have to keep me around. The entertainment value has to be authentic. And I know that you probably all have lots of questions. I'll just remind you, at the end of the webinar, you'll be able to ask questions about all of this. So, you know, don't be a hater on entertainment when it comes to documentaries, because it's a really important aspect of what we do. You know, as long as it's authentic. Now, I use this example a lot because I think it's one that's easy to identify for people and to understand, and it's Lord of the Rings, which is a very epic, complex narrative. It's filled with lots of characters, each who are on their own quest. So now, you know, I'll ask people, so, you know, what is the story? And they glaze over and they think, wow, I don't know what the story is. But, you know, really, we have a 9-hour narrative here. You know, so what is the story? How do I distill the story? Well, on my part, I must admit, it's maybe a bit of a trick question, because I think I'm probably, well, I know that I'm asking the wrong question. So if you want to know what the story is, what you really need to ask yourself is, whose story is it? Now, again, this is a very long narrative. It's like, I think it's probably 9 hours. But whose story is it? You know, this is Frodo's story, and if we lay this template of Frodo's story onto the equation, you know, Frodo his quest is to take this ring and throw it into the volcano. And what's at stake? Well, Frodo's own mortality is at stake, and And if he doesn't do it, the world is going to end. Those are pretty high stakes. And you can lay this onto every story that you do and make this equation work. And it'll help you get there really fast and efficiently. I can't really stress this strong enough, is that this equation is really the core of storytelling in our business, in feature film, and really even in great storytelling in print. It's a character on a quest here. Frodo has to cross a very hostile landscape, and he's got these forces that are trying to stop him. And if he doesn't get there, the stakes are very big. The consequences are very, very big. So, but why Frodo? Of all those characters, why did Tolkien pick this character to be the main character? Because he's got no special powers. He's not the strongest. He's not the wisest. He's a little naive. He's maybe got a lot to learn. But if you deconstruct a story, and I encourage you to do this. And this is one of the ways that I learned storytelling, was to watch documentaries and feature films and deconstruct them. And I think it'll become very evident if you were to deconstruct Lord of the Rings, why Frodo is the best choice of the main character here. So this is a term that you may have heard before, and it's character arc. And for me, the big question is, which character in your story that you're researching, you're about to go do, provides the narrative the best opportunity for them to be transformed over the course of the story? Now, that's a really important question, because that's going to answer why should the audience care? Why, again, back to why Frodo. Why not pick Aragorn, who's the king? Why not follow him? Well, I think probably one of the reasons that Tolkien picked somebody like Frodo, because he's like you and me. He's every man. So a lot of you sent in some really great questions. One of them was about casting. It's like, how do I cast my documentary? Well, it's a very good question, and hopefully you're going to have a process now to be able to do that. And the first question to ask is, who has the most at stake? So who has the most to lose? And who has the greatest opportunity for authentic transformation? And that's something that's going to happen over the course of their quest, and whether it's physical danger that they're going to be in, or emotional jeopardy. And if you look at some of the highest rated nonfiction series, documentary series on television now, you'll see that this is two of the reasons why they're so popular. You think about a show like Deadliest Catch. I mean, there are some characters and who are in physical danger, because after about 1 hour of watching guys crab fishing, it's not so interesting. But there's a lot of inherent physical danger in that job, and there's some emotional jeopardy. All of those characters are on a quest, and it's those characters and that quest that brings audiences back week after week. So this is a way that you can ask when you have an idea. And for me, when I made Lost Nuke, it's like, okay, I want to find a nuclear weapon, but how do I cast this? Well, I had to go out and find authentic characters who were actually had something at stake and were actually already looking for that. And out of probably 12 people that I found, I cast that expedition from those 12 people based on who had the most at stake, and for most of them it was emotional jeopardy more than it was physical danger. But what about when the storyteller is a character? And there's some good examples of when the storyteller is the character. Somebody asked one of the questions, what about Super Size Me? I want to do something like Super Size Me, where Morgan Spurlock was the main character there. And, you know, when I worked in news, oftentimes the reporter would want to be the main character. And my question always was, well, is there somebody, you don't have anything at stake, you don't have anything to lose, why should anybody care about your story? So I think the important thing here is when you're casting, if you're trying to decide, well, should I be the storyteller? I think the answer to that question is, if you cannot find anybody, find a character who has an authentic stake that's bigger than yours. And, you know, Michael Moore has made a career out of being the main character of the stories. He is the character of his stories, and Michael is always on a quest to achieve something. As in Morgan Spurlock too, his documentaries are mostly about Morgan being on a quest. In television news, that's not, you know, for me, that's not very operative with the audience. I think it's a fast way to disconnect the audience from the story, is to make the reporter the character. But sometimes you have no choice. But so yes, when it comes to can I be the storyteller, the answer would be yes, but only if you cannot find somebody who's got more at stake than you. Well, what if I have more than one character? Can you tell a story with more than one character? And this is something that is called parallel development. When you have, and sometimes you'll have, the only way you can tell your story is with more than one character. And often it's a narrative that follows opposing characters on the same quest. Now, this is a film that I made a couple of years ago for PBS called Battle Over the X-Planes. Again, it was one of those pitches where the broadcaster accused me of making the story up, but it's a story about the two largest aerospace companies in the world vying for the largest military contract in history to build what could be America's last manned fighter. And the winner, talk about stakes, got a check for $200 billion. So there's a lot at stake here. So I could have followed one of the teams, but it wouldn't have served the story. So I followed both teams. So when you have characters who are on the same quest, and then you can have more than one character, and they're going to come in collision at some point in the narrative. So think about, are there competing forces? And an example of this on a television, if you watch, say, Survivor or The Amazing Race, these are all characters. I wouldn't really call this reality television. I'd call it manufactured television because it's all manufactured, it's all set up. But these are all characters who have the same quest. They're opposing forces. In the case of Survivor, everybody wants to win $1 million. And sometimes, editorially, the narrative requires multiple characters with similar stakes to complete the quest. Now, when I made Lost Nuke, I couldn't hang that story on one character because there wasn't one character that editorially filled all of the roles that I needed. So I needed somebody that was an expert on nuclear weapons. I needed somebody that was an expert on the story. I needed somebody who was an expert on the airplane. So in casting that, I picked 3 characters for that expedition who all had intimate knowledge or an expertise, and I launched them on a quest. So you can have parallel characters on the same quest, vying for the same golden ring at the end. Now, there's a warning when it comes to all of this, and it's going to be very easy to load your story with too many characters. It's the fastest way to lose your audience. It's like, they cannot follow too many characters. And I hear audiences talk about, I didn't know who was who at the end, and why would I care about that guy or that character. So I think you have to be really diligent about what to leave out here. And it's easier to do it up front than it is, to wait till it gets to your editor, and your editor's going to go, wow, you have 12 main characters here. We cannot make a film with 12 main characters. So just be very aware of littering your story with too many characters. Now, access. I mean, this is, at least in the kind of films that I do, is incredibly important. And why would a character let you tell their story? And this is a question that people ask me a lot, because I'm, the only filmmaker ever allowed into a U.S. Department of Defense weapons project. And it's like, why? What did you do? What kind of magic did you? What did you say? What were the magic words to get you into that project? And really, you need to, you know what's in it for you and why you want to tell the story, but you need to ask yourself some questions about what's in it for them. Why are they going to want to let me have intimate access to tell their story? And in the end, like anything in this business, it's all about trust and integrity. If they can't trust you and you're not going to do what you say, then it's unlikely that you're going to get access. I mean, when I made Battle of the X-Planes, that got me access to the next story. And the story after that got me access to the Russian and Chinese and American space program based on that track record. So this is incredibly important, and you can't play fast and loose with the truth with your characters. You have to do what you say and say what you do. And if you do that, you can get access into some pretty unbelievable places. And to be quite honest about Battle of the X-Planes, I asked the question. I just happened to be the first person who asked the question who they thought that they could trust and be responsible with their story. Now, this is something that I can't stress strong enough, and I often laugh because I hear him say it often. I'm a big fan of Jon Stewart, and he says, just be a human being. And I think that's what people are most interested in. Is they're not interested if you might not be the world's greatest technical filmmaker. You might have questionable images and sound in your stories. Probably not, but for the most part, people want to know that you're one of them and that they can trust you. And the key for accessing the story and unlocking your character's quest is being a good people person. And if people show you who they are, you should believe them. This is a motto that I truly believe in, and I use it when I'm hiring other crews to work for me. And it's something that you need to pay really close attention to when you first meet your character, when you've identified your character, is not to look so much for what you expect, but look for what they're telling you, both in their actions and what they say. And you have to be, I have to admit, a bit of an amateur psychologist to be able to read people. But there's an amazing amount of information that people give you when you sit down and talk to them. And a lot of it, they're not even giving it to you in a very overt kind of conscious way. Once people feel that they're comfortable with you, they'll tell you just about anything. And my wife always teases me about the fact that I collect characters. I mean, I have people come up to me on the street and just want to tell me their story. And I think the idea that if you're a people person and that you have a good handle on story, that it kind of changes your gravity. And it's kind of like the difference between, Mercury and Saturn. Saturn has a lot more gravity. And I think if you have good people skills and you understand story, then those stories are just going to show up. And people ask me all the time, like, how do I find a good story? how do I find, where do I get it? And I have to tell you, honestly, that they just show up. And I think it's once that you have your radar set for what a story is and what makes a good story that they do. They just kind of show up. And it seems like every story that I've done, when I'm working on a film, it kind of leads me into the next story, kind of shows up during the making of that story. So I talked a little bit earlier about Aristotle and his essential 7 elements of Greek theater. But I want to sort of introduce this to you as your checklist, which is what I call the essential 5, which is story, character, structure, theme, and tone. And we'll come back to this a little bit later, but this is a checklist that you might want to just keep on hand. And this is a really, I love metaphors. This is a really great metaphor for structure is an onion. And because it's got many layers, it's going to take a little bit of hard work and to get down to the center of it. But, you know, in there, this is a really great way to think about visually. I'm a visual person, to think about, you know, a story, how I'm going to unravel the story. One of the questions I got prior to this was, you know, talked a little bit about, you know, can I introduce a 3-act structure? Well, this is a 3-act structure. It applies, you know, to Greek theater as much as it does to documentary storytelling and to feature films. And this is sometimes called the whale's tail or the grid, but this is a 3-act structure. Now I'm just going to use my cursor here. But the prologue, you know, and each of these have a very specific goal. But the prologue is the hook. That's where you're going to get people in the tent. So you're going to introduce your character and their quest and the stakes. Now, this is where people that do a lot of producers that I've worked with in the past, they come and they've done a lot of research, and so they have a lot of context, which is backstory. And they want to, since they've got all this research, they want to include it. But it's the first part of your story which can detour you. And we don't want to make it a detour. We want to make it maybe a speed bump, but we don't want to make it a detour. So I'm going to get a little bit more into context, but it's really all the things that the audience needs to know, or at least not all the things, but the essential basic things they need to know so your character can start the quest, which starts down here. So if you want to make this context a lot more shallower, then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can do that and litter it a little bit more throughout your documentary than right at the beginning, right in one spot. And so really the beginning, we talk about beginning, middle, and end, the beginning and the end are the smallest little bits of the story. So the beginning is going to be up until and including the context, and the middle is going to start at the quest and at the climax. And the climax and the wrap are really the ending to your story. TP1 and TP2, that stands for turning point. So there's going to be something in your story, and you might have more than 2. You might have one at 15 minutes that are going to propel your story forward. Might be a revelation or a surprise. It's going to keep your audience hooked and want to make them stay on to see if the character is able to complete whether their quest fails or succeeds. So again, the beginning, you're going to introduce your character or characters, the quest, the stakes. You're going to set the tone. You know, maybe introduce the inciting moment. What was the moment that launched this quest? And you're going to establish the theme. So context are the key elements the audience needs to understand before the quest begins. And this is often sparse of visuals. So if it's the backstory, for instance, in Battle of the X-Planes, it was about these 2 big companies, so I had to tell the audience a little bit about the backstory of these companies. You want to keep that very short because you're usually not going to have good visuals. It's going to be largely could be archive footage, or you might not have visuals. You might be a recreation of some kind. And I have found the most effective way to use context is rather than if you've got a lot of context, the audience needs to know a lot of information to be able to understand the quest, is to weave that into your main narrative, and then you'll take that shallow dive out of the context and intersperse it throughout the story. Middle is going to be the biggest piece of your documentary. It's where you're going to build tension, you're going to raise the stakes, reveal motivation, reveal your character's nature, turning points, an event or revelation that propels a story forward. Again, it's that onion metaphor. And the end is the climax. Your character's quest is either going to succeed or it's going to fail. It doesn't have to succeed to be a great story. Oftentimes, if it fails, it's a better story, but it's not really the storyteller's decision. It's really going to be, it's following the character's quest to see what happens at the end. If the quest does not end, there needs to be a substantial revelation. You need to reveal something to make the audience, to give the audience some kind of satisfaction to the story. Well, it might not be fully concluded, but it's got to a point where I can't wait to see what the next chapter is. And the climax is the untoppable moment. It's going to be the thing that, the moment of your film that can't be, it's going to be the, oh my God, I can't believe that just happened. It's going to be the thing you build towards. And when you're casting your documentary, identifying the quest, it's maybe a good place to start too. Is like, where does the quest end? Once I know where the quest ends, I can fill in the middle part a lot more easier. And the wrap is just, what does the future hold for the character? What are the implications of the quest succeeding or failing? And you're going to let the viewer interpret how they feel about that. Well, so how do you find the drama? Where is the drama in my story? Well, this is another little tool that you can use to help identify the drama, is the people that help. And again, I'll use Lord of the Rings here. These are all the people that are helping Frodo on his quest. And then we have the people that are trying to stop Frodo from succeeding on his quest. And in like all human endeavors, there's people that are actually both, or elements that are both. So when I'm asked about, so where is the drama? How do I find the drama? Well, this is a really good tool, is if you can make a list of all the people that are trying to help your main character and those that are trying to hinder your main character. And there's going to be some that do both. And the next question ultimately is, okay, well, I know where the drama is. Where do I put the character? And another thing to keep in mind here is time. Time is also can hinder your character, but it has to be authentic. You know, it's easy to put in the ticking clock that they only have so much time to fulfill their quest or accomplish their mission, but make sure it's authentic. Or we're dealing with a very literate audience these days, and they're gonna feel that that's inauthentic if it's not real. But where do I put the camera? Well, this is where the drama is. When Frodo is in collision with any of these, this is where the drama is. Now, there is drama a little bit with the people, with the characters that are trying to help Frodo on his quest, but for the most part, they're the opposing forces. So if you want to know where to put the camera with your main character, identify what the opposing forces are, who is trying to hinder your character's quest, and that'll be the time that you want to make sure that you're there and that you're rolling. So again, our little checklist, story, character, structure, theme, and tone, just as a reminder of where we are. So theme. These are human conventions. It's the message, moral, or comment that you're going to make in your film. Again, these are human conventions. It could be about redemption, fear, injustice. I talked a little bit about my dinosaur story, that was about validation and acceptance. And what's important about the theme and identifying the theme is that's going to give you emotional depth to your story. So it's going to be easy to find what the physical quest of your character is, but if you can identify their emotional quest, identify the theme, that's really going to give some emotional depth to your story, and it's really going to add to the audience, like, why do they care about this? Why are they going to be emotionally engaged in my story? So we as storytellers, we're always going to have a point of view. From composition to editing, we're always going to have a point of view. If you have a point of view, there's nothing wrong with having a point of view, but I think it's important, if you're going to have one, a very strong point of view as a filmmaker, you have to show the audience that it was hard to get there. You have to let them do the interpretation. And if they do, they're going to argue amongst themselves, and they're going to argue with you. But while doing that, they're going to be illuminated, and that's exactly what you want to have happen. You know, I come from a journalism background, and journalistic rigor is incredibly important. The truth is important, but facts and truth are essential, but on their own, they are neither sticky or compelling without a story. So you can have your journalistic rigor, you can have the important facts and figures, but without a story, it's not going to be as memorable. And that's what you want. You want people to remember your stories. And this is very important, is people watch films more with their heart than they do with their head. It's more of a visceral experience than it is an intellectual experience. Now, if you can mix both, that's awesome. Some of the best investigative journalism I've seen is a mix of both. It's one of the things that I love about Ken Burns documentaries. Even though they're mostly archive footage, he does a great job of engaging my emotions and my intellect, and I think that's why they're so timeless. So tone, how do I want the audience to feel? And there's only certain things that you can help impart a tone. I talked about writing with the camera. That's using focal length, whether you're using a wide lens or a long lens. You can shoot a close-up on a wide lens, and you can shoot it on a long lens, but they feel totally different, even though they're the same kind of framing. Lighting is another way you can impart tone, sound, editing, and music. Narrative voice, who's telling the story? Again, let the story decide. It's going to be your main character, it could be witnesses, experts. For me, the narrator is always the last thing. The narrator is going to help fill in those holes. Or the narrative voice could be you, the storyteller. Style. What style do I use? Well, I think if you start applying the process of finding the story, you'll let the story decide. Ultimately, the story has to decide, or it's going to be totally out of context, your visuals. Again, you're going to come up against challenges. Your financier or your broadcaster or the studio that's going to finance your film is going to maybe not be perhaps know story as well as you do. Your access, your budget, these are all things that are going to have a bearing on your story. So this is a really important thing, and I think if you are a producer or director and you're working with a team, this is one of the things that I think is really that you need to put on the table up front, is the creative team must acknowledge that their talent and expertise is only valuable if it serves a story. If you're just serving the writer or the editor or it's the cinematographer, it's got to be the pretty shot, and it's not serving the story, then you're going to be in trouble. So couple of great quotes here that I love, and I put it in the teaser for Marcelo about doing shooters with Charlie Chaplin and Ed Murrow. This is Chaplin said a great thing about he made great silent movies, and I always set out to not make a silent movie, but to make a film without any narration, just let the character tell the story. And Charlie always said, the hard part was thinking. When it comes, and I think what he meant about that was that front-end loading that I talked about. Edward R. Murrow, great journalist, and he said, you want to tell big stories, tell the small stories. He did one of the first big television documentary on the Korean War with a bunch of radio reporters who sat around a table and all said, well, how do we tell the story? It's so big. And he said, well, go out and tell the small stories. Tell me the story about the helicopter pilot or the doctor in the ER who hasn't slept for 24 hours. You tell the small stories, you tell the human stories, and you will tell the big story. Can you break the rules? Absolutely, you can. If it works, nothing else matters. This idea of front-end loading, the plan is everything, and the plan is nothing. You have to know the plan and the process to be able to break it. So in summary, front-end load. This by employing this creative process of story, identifying the essential five, the story, the character, the structure, theme, and tone, you're going to add a lot of creative freedom to your process, and that's exactly what you want to do. And here's something else I want about identifying your stories is let good stories go. It's hard enough to get movies, to get documentaries made and financed, and so let the good stories go and focus on great stories. Financiers are interested in advertising and return on investment. So pick good stories, pick those holy crap moments that you can tell great stories. Find a character on an active quest, tell their story well, find characters with big stakes. If the only thing that you walk away from in my webinar is this equation, I think this is something that can be incredibly helpful and transformational. And remember, story, story, story. If you focus on story, then I think story will transform into dollars. So I hope you enjoyed my webinar and got some new tools for your own creating your own process.